presentation.
Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Well, that's good. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And this year we're celebrating the cultural and geographic regions in the United States. And during, well, it's the last lecture of week 8, we're exploring the region of the U.S. known as the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes region is known for its abundant fresh water, vibrant outdoor recreation, and strong industrial history. And we are fortunate that Bruce Kopitek is back today. This morning's presentation, Save a Day, the C&B, is supported by Mary Lou and Don Leffler. The Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company provided popular passenger steamship services across Lake Erie from 1893 to 1938, connecting Cleveland and Buffalo with an increasingly large, fast vessels that served both travelers and freight. Founded by Thomas Newman after his proposal was rejected by the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, the C&B line grew into a successful competitor and sought to surpass its Detroit-based rival in the early 1900s. Bruce is retired from the field of architecture after 45 years and has been pursuing a career in publishing ever since. And he has written several books, including A History of Hudson's, Detroit's world-famous department store. And then this weekend during the boat show on Sunday at 1:30, the Lakeside Heritage Society, in collaboration with the Lakeside Wooden Boat Society, I think I said that right, they will be having a lecture on the lawn in the Lakeside tent concerning steamships, smaller steamships that serve this area of the lake. So please check it out. And then, of course, there's a lot, as you can imagine, there's a lot going on this weekend. The plein air artists will be here. Now, while you may have seen in the, the events for today that the plein air artists are canceled, The artists are, if they want to, they can be here, of course, to paint. So you'll be seeing more than likely plein air artists around the campus painting, as you probably noticed as you came into Orchestra Hall. With that said, I would ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming back to Orchestra Hall, Bruce.
Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you coming here in spite of the horrible air condition that you wandered outside to come here. We're probably more comfortable inside today than out. But I really appreciate that you took your time to come. How many people were here yesterday? Vast majority. So this is something here and there might be a little bit repetitive, but I ask you to bear with me because I think it's all really interesting information. And I just want to note, at the risk of sounding like or looking like a hobo, I still wore my Dewey Line shirt today because if you were here yesterday, you know about it, but I was invited a month ago to Cedar Lake in Indiana, and they have preserved a lifeboat from one of the Great Lakes passenger steamships, converted it into a steam launch with an actual steam engine, and it runs around the lake there. There's a museum called Lassen's Resort Museum. Really fascinating place, a beautiful little lake out in the middle of nowhere, south of Gary, Indiana, of all places. But it's really a nice spot. So I like to publicize them with my Dewey Line shirt because that's a great experience. So I just wanted to tell you, I do have more than one shirt with me on this little trip, but we're good. So today I want to talk a little bit about something more local. And John specifically asked me if I would do a lecture on something like a local topic. Did any of these ships come nearby here? And of course, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, which was an offshoot of and sort of friendly rival of the big DNC line out of Detroit. And I can explain how this all happened. But those ships, had a very profitable line that went between Cleveland and Buffalo, and their slogan was, "Save a day the C&B way." Because at the time when these ships were popular, the line was founded in 1892. They began operation with hand-me-down ships in 1893. And at the time, the condition of any roads, of course, though the car hadn't really become popularized by then, but into the 1910s, 20s, 30s, when they were doing business at the height of their capacity, the roads between Cleveland and Buffalo were notoriously bad. So if someone was going out east, you could start your journey by bypassing all those roads and taking the ship to Buffalo from Cleveland. And the other part is John mentioned that these ships carried cargo, and they all were able to take package freight, which meant that you came down to the dock, made a contract to get your package to Buffalo or vice versa, and they were something like the Federal Express so that you could get there overnight on the C&B line. But they also had, the freight capacity was very large, so you could take your car on, and at one point, I think in the 1920s, it was $5 to take a car on. So if you could get onto the better New York roads maybe at the time rather than struggling all the way up the western coast of Lake Erie. So with that in mind, just as a beginning, like I said, save a day the C&B way. Let's get into a little bit. And you can see from some of their advertising and some of their marketing material that they did present themselves as a very fine, on their advertising there on the left side, all of their passengers are shown very, very well dressed and quite stately, looking out from the rails of another C&B ship at their magnificent 1913 ship that was called the C&B. We'll get into that. It has an interesting name and an interesting way the name came about as well. And all of this, of course, is covered in my book called the DNC Lake Lines and the Fabulous Luxury Liners of the Great Lakes. I cover 7 different steamship lines that operated on the Great Lakes all the way up through the St. Lawrence River. And today we have 7 cruise lines operating many of these same routes as they take cruises throughout the area. And they're apparently very popular, but they're very, very expensive. One of them is Viking Lines. And if you compare the cost of a Viking river cruise in Europe to the cost of a Great Lakes cruise, it's about 4 times more, which I don't quite understand because we're so close. And maybe the break is that you don't have to pay for too much airfare to get to one of the departure points. But I do, all this information was a result of really my love that was inherited from my father, who was in the Navy in World War II and served at D-Day. And he had a love of ships after he served in the Navy. And I grew up in Detroit, not too far from the river, so one of our favorite Sunday activities would be, Bruce, Patrick, Mary, let's go down by the river and we're going to just watch the ships go by. And so just as a kid, you absorb all this kind of thing. And as I'm older, into my retirement age, and I do appreciate everything that my parents gave me. So that's really where this comes from. So I asked yesterday about the D&C line. Who cares, really, and why? Because sometimes you talk about a historical subject. I wanted to, when I mentioned the shirt I'm wearing, I wanted to say that I didn't quite look like a hobo because I only had one shirt to wear. And Carol and I, we kind of like etymology a lot, so we'll find terms that people don't use anymore. And hobo is, you don't get a good hobo anymore, we say. But it was a little bit of an anachronistic term that kind of fit with this era. And so Cleveland, just like Detroit, many of the things that would be taken for granted in Cleveland at one time aren't there anymore. Some of it's been replaced by good new things, but obviously there's a certain sense of loss. Carol and I drove to Cleveland yesterday, and the air quality was horrific. We could not even see, driving on the high-level bridge, we couldn't even see the terminal tower. It was so thick. So we decided we were going to go inside, get in the casino. I wanted to see the old Higbee building, but Carol likes her slot machines, so she had several hours of entertainment for a very little amount of money. She did really well. And we were able to enjoy that. But a lot of things are just missing. Of course, we know that Cleveland is called the Forest City. Had a great industrial potential at one time. It was founded by General Cleveland, who actually set up the plan of the public square with the streets radiating out of it, much like Detroit, in a way had a planned beginning. But this location at the outlet of the Cuyahoga River on Lake Erie was very propitious because industry was happy to locate there. I saw the old Globe Iron shipyard property, things like that are all part of this maritime heritage. So I think remembering those things, there's a sense of loss sometimes. I always felt there was a loss when the terminal tower wasn't the tallest building, because my brother used to live in Rochester, New York, and we'd drive by and I could see the skyline of Cleveland, and always that terminal tower was the tallest. But now we've got a lot of companies that build extremely large office buildings that aren't very profitable anymore. They might be converted to apartments like they're doing all over the country, but sort of that view is a little bit lost. And of course, the institutions of the city, many of them are gone. Thank God you still have the Cleveland Orchestra and things like that. But of course, our wonderful department stores, of which Higbee's was certainly one of the best in the country, was a real landmark. And I was sad to see that in that casino, it's nice, it's been redone, but it's not Higbee's. So let's put it. The building's been preserved, unlike our Hudson's in Detroit that was unfortunately imploded. And this is the old dock on the Cuyahoga River. You see one of the older bridges there, and you're looking over 2 tugs, and you see here one of the C&B boats from their old dock that was right on the Cuyahoga River. So the C&B worked with the government and the city of Cleveland and arranged a condition whereby they could build the 9th Street Pier, which is where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is right now. And so I drove out onto that pier. It's a dead-end parking area, so I turned around and got off. But I could say that I was at least on the 9th Street Pier that was built in 1915. But this is gone. Those old buildings along there, the flats are somewhat preserved, but really not that. Now, you can see another, probably a Detroit and Cleveland navigation ship across the water there. As you know, the Cuyahoga River goes like this. Can you imagine how hard it would be to navigate a great big ship like that right through a river? So as a result, as the ships got bigger, they had a deeper draft, they were wider, couldn't fit in the Cuyahoga River anymore, so the pier had to be built. And of course, that is the pier as it looked in its heyday, with the great ship C&B pulling away from the dock. It was pretty innovative because it had both one of the conditions of it being built was that there was a trolley car line that went out so passengers who were traveling without a car could just take the trolley and get there. And of course, it was a good example of separating pedestrian and freight traffic. The freight traffic, even a railroad spur, could bring freight to the terminal for freighters, and pedestrians would be on the other side of the building. And that the head house was where the waiting room and ticket offices and all that were. It's all gone. It's all been removed through time. And I mentioned this is very similar, but when I say who cares, this history, I talked about how my father inspired me, but my own mother rode on the Tajmo, which is the boat you see there, and it was a very fast Detroit-based excursion ship that sailed for the White Star Line on a day basis, not a night boat basis, from Toledo all the way up to Port Huron and back, stopping at Tajmo Island Park. It sunk outside, it hit a rock in Amherstburg, Ontario, and it wasn't that badly damaged, but when they tried to raise the ship, the keel cracked and it was a loss. So that happened in 1932. My mother was born in 1925. So when she was maybe 5 to 7 years old, she was. So this is part of my history, and I love my mother. I love the history. In 1901, the Tajmo was involved in something that was been referred to as the Great Race. And I like this picture. It shows the start of the race. The owner of the White Star Line, whose name escapes me at the moment, was bragging about how fast the Tajmo was. The C&B line had just built its city of Erie in 1898, and it quickly gained the reputation. It was the biggest ship on the Great Lakes at the time, biggest passenger carrier steamship. And the line was bragging about it because of the speed it could attain with its high horsepower engines, and the city of Erie became known as the Speed Queen of the Great Lakes. That was how it was advertised. So at one point, the owner of the White Star Line made comments and said that, well, if our Tajmo raced the city of Erie, we would just show her our tail. That there was no way that the city of Erie could beat the Tajmo. Well, the C&B line president, Thomas Newton, even though that comment was made jokingly, he turned around and said, bring it on. Let's have this, and let's put some money behind it too. I'm going to put down $1,000. Are you? And so the other guy was forced into this competition, and the plan was that whichever boat won, either the mayor of Cleveland or the mayor of Detroit would get the money and then would donate it to the city for a public project. As it happens, 1901, there was a great fanfare, all kinds of betting galore. I mean, I think there was probably more betting going on than there is in Las Vegas these days on that race. So you can see the Tajmo on the left, and two of the C&B liners at the time. Probably the city of Erie is the one that's facing that way, but the city of Buffalo, is a smaller ship, is standing by, sort of as a second at a duel, right? They're just there to attend, and probably people were on there just to watch the race. And a gunshot was fired, and the race was off. And this became a very famous thing that's still talked about on the anniversary. It was 1901, so in 2001 it was 100 years since that race happened. But every now and then it'll pop up in the newspaper. I do a lot of research in newspapers, and if I just search through the Cleveland Plain Dealer and say Tajmo City of Erie race, even in the 90s, and that on an anniversary it'll come up and people will tell the tale again of how famous this race was. I like this photograph because you see the absolute flatness of the lake spreading out behind those ships. The other night I enjoyed, before it became impossible, last night we were driving back from Cleveland in the sunset, and there came a point, the sun wasn't even, it was like maybe 6:30 in the evening, and you couldn't even see the sun anymore. It was up there, a big red ball in the sky because of all the smoke, but once the smoke got too dense as it went down, you saw nothing. And I don't know if anybody went out to the pier last night to watch the sunset. It was a no-go, pretty much. So, but the other night when we did that, from here you could see that big expanse of water, and you could see Perry's Victory Monument off in the distance. And as I said yesterday, it just hit me that all this happened right there. And the Cleveland and Buffalo had a line that went from, in addition to their main business between Cleveland and Buffalo, they did day trips. At first, when they were formed, they bought a piece of property on the Black River at Lorain. And their intention was to develop that as a recreational and amusement park, so that during the day, after their ships had made the run to Buffalo and came back to Cleveland, they could use them to go to this park on the Black River. And that lasted for a while and then fell out of favor. But they did have a line that you could take one of their day steamers from Cleveland to Put-in-Bay, Port Clinton, and then to Toledo, and return in one day. So that was very popular, and as I sat and watched the sunset, I said, these ships just went by right there. And it was always advertised in the DNC line that as you went from Detroit to Cleveland, you could see the Perry's Victory Monument there. It was such a major, major thing. So I feel like standing here, I'm standing in the very history that I'm trying to espouse. The picture helps that. The other people that carry, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. The other people that carry, if you see the fellow there with an organ, he's now retired. He's actually living in an assisted living at an advanced age. He is the son of Philip Swartz, who was the general manager of the C&B line from the late 20s until it went out of business in 1938. The line was in trouble in the late 10s and 20s because of a couple bad decisions that were made. And his father resurrected the line for the last couple years until he became frustrated with the ownership, which included a gentleman at that time in the 30s by the name of Alva Bradley, who was the owner of the Cleveland Indians on top of it. So we had, this gentleman actually contacted me and said, my father ran the C&B line. So he was just a font of a lot of really incredible stories. And that's his father. He sent me a picture of his father that I incorporated into the book. So they care. I mean, he said, my family's going to be so happy when they see this book because our history is going to be in it. So obviously, their family cares. And as a result of that, I found out a really, really interesting thing. There is this lady, and this is a somewhat recent picture. She lives in Mentor, Ohio. She's just in June, turned 109 years old. She got her job. She was cousin to Phil Swartz's wife. And she, at the age of 14, applied for a job as a dancer. She loved to dance, applied for a job as a dancer in one of the floor shows, which you don't get a good floor show anymore, I don't think, but dancer that would be on the ship to entertain people. She lied about her age. She was only 14 years old. She said she was 16 and could get the job then. So she spent the rest of her years, as long as the DNC line was operating, and then the subsidiary from Chicago that followed in the operation of that big ship, she was employed dancing on that ship. And I was able to get from her son a picture of her at that 14-year-old age doing a dance routine on the boat. And so it's just utterly amazing that this woman is still with us and that has this history behind her. That's something to care about, I'd say. Now, how did this company come about? I talked about the immigration being the real fuel for the DNC line to Detroit. In the 1890s, the rail travel between New York City and Detroit was much more established. You had fast express trains that could make the trip in 20 hours, which was fast at the time. Later on, they could do it in less than 16. I don't know. Today's Amtrak probably takes 24 or 30, but that's progress for you, right? And so that was the C&B line, which was formed in 1892 legally, didn't really have the immigrant traffic at that point in time. It was anybody would, like my grandparents did, got off in New York City, Ellis Island, and on a New York Central train bound for Detroit. But there was a need, according to what Thomas F. Newton, who was the agent for the DNC line, their representative in Cleveland, saw that there were a lot of people that really wanted to go to Buffalo. And at the time, there was no organized trip. Like the whole story of the whole thing, people would just go to the dock and see if there was a ship that was, captain had a ship that was going to Buffalo. And he'd say, yeah, but I'm not going until tomorrow. They'd go home, come back to the top, go to Buffalo. There was no reservations. They just paid cash right to the captain and went. And so he proposed to the DNC line, his employer, that, hey, I think we could make a lot of money on a Buffalo to Cleveland run and vice versa. And the DNC line rejected his idea, which didn't sit well with Thomas F. Newton because he saw the demand. And what they said was that if we were to do that, it would look like to the New York Central Railroad that we were trying to compete with them between Detroit and Buffalo, and we don't want to do that. So we're not going to entertain that at all, because they relied on the New York Central to drop off passengers and traffic. Now, to get to Detroit around the end of Lake Erie, it's an arduous journey that by car takes over 3 hours from Cleveland. I used to work for a company. I had clients in Cleveland. If we needed to go to Cleveland, we either had to get up at 5 in the morning and get to the airport and fly to get there by 9 o'clock, or if we drove, you'd have to get up even earlier, because it was over 3 hours to drive that long way southwest to Toledo and then back to Cleveland. So it made a lot of sense for the DNC to have this Cleveland to Detroit line, because it was more or less a straight shot on the water. Plus, in comfort, in a nice bed, after having a nice dinner and maybe a few drinks in a pub, on the ship, you could wake up rested and ready to go the next morning in Cleveland, have your meeting, and do the whole thing again on the way back and be back the next morning. So that was very, very profitable. But they just didn't want to get into competing with the railroad between Cleveland and Buffalo. So what did Thomas Newton do? Which is what I would do. I hated it when people rejected my ideas as just crazy and not workable. For whatever frivolous reason, that still happens. You go ahead, you do an end run. You do what you need to do to prove yourself, prove your ideas. And so Thomas Newton quit the DNC line, got involved with the father of Alva Bradley and a number of other Cleveland investors, and formed his own Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company to operate that line. Now, they needed ships. At the same time, well, this is Thomas F. Newton in a drawing out of the newspaper, just to see what he looked like. So they needed ships. And you can see here in an early ad for the DNC line, they're offering magnificent side wheel steamers, state of Ohio and state of New York. At the same time that Newton was forming the C&B line, the DNC line was looking to build bigger ships for its Toledo, Detroit to Mackinac run, which are operated by two fairly small steamships. And they said, if we could sell those, we would have the money to build. We can take out a loan based on that and build bigger ships for ourselves, which they did, and they wound up selling them to Thomas F. Newton. So really, these were hand-me-down ships from the DNC line, the first of which had been known as the City of Cleveland. It was an iron-hulled ship built in 1880, and you can see it's not very big compared to some of the images of the big C&B that I've shown there. It had two stacks side by side with the DNC logo in between. You can't quite see it there. And that did a lot of service. It was already pretty well worn in, but the C&B line bought them, renovated them, and took that as one of their boats. The second one was formerly called the City of Alpena, and it was built in 1883. So it was less than 10 years old, but still it was about the same size as the City of Cleveland. Not large, but for the day, they could still advertise that these were pretty large, comfortable ships. And so that was how they started their operation. And it was really, for the most part, it was a test. They got these smaller ships at a bargain price from the DNC line, operated them for a year or two from 1893, and by 1895, they realized we're making money. We're making money hand over fist on this Cleveland to Buffalo line, which proved Thomas Newton correct, that there was money to be had there. And the line grew in popularity, grew in renown for safety, for timeliness and everything, in spite of the fact that it went through the western end of Lake Erie, which can be very treacherous, and we'll talk about that. Just in brief, many stories of these original steamers wound up, if they left Buffalo, chances were a gale would come up and the ship would be blown. Look, there's examples of these ships just being blown right back to Buffalo Harbor by a storm. Out of control, lost power, lost control. The very first steamship on the Great Lakes was called Walk in the Water. And this was in 1820-something. And it was a very small ship. It took forever to get anywhere because it just didn't have the power. And it wound up making several successful runs from Buffalo to Cleveland to Toledo to Detroit. but it hit a gale and was blown onto the beach at the very end of Lake Erie and cracked its keel as it hit the beach. This is in the middle of a terrible storm, so the passengers had to get off. Not a great crowd because it wasn't a giant ship, but passengers got off and sheltered in a lighthouse overnight until the dawn came and the storm went away and people could come and rescue them. 1820 didn't have roads, you didn't have ambulances or anything like that, so more boats set us out from Buffalo. So that was sort of an omen for what was really to come, given the nature, the stormy nature of the west end of Lake Erie and the shallowness of it that produces some pretty significant waves. But they were on the road to success, for sure. You can see here's an image of the inside of one of those ships taken from a brochure at the time that I found in some archives. And that interior looks a little bit ornate, but it also looks a little small. The stairway is just wide enough for one person, not a grand stairway by any imagination, but the decor and everything seems quite typical for that sort of Edwardian or Victorian area ship. Now, on the right hand is a very interesting thing. This is how the former city of Alpena wound up after it did some work on that line from Cleveland to Toledo, and then eventually went on Lake Michigan for a while. That wasn't successful, came back, was sold here, sold there, and wound up as the clubhouse of the Columbia Yacht Club in Chicago, right in Chicago Harbor off of Lakeshore Drive. And it was remodeled, obviously, to be a clubhouse, and that lasted, and it wasn't removed until 1992, I think, where it was removed and scrapped. So that's a longevity of well over 100 years of service that this thing put in at some point or another. But the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company basically, as I said, worked that main line from Cleveland to Buffalo, and then they had this Toledo, Cedar Point, Put-in-Bay line that we spoke about. But eventually, and that's the city of Buffalo, in a painting there by Father Edward Dowling, who was a engineering professor at the University of Detroit, where I attained my degrees. And I never knew him. I crossed paths with him in the 70s, probably. But he was a talented painter, and he was the primary Great Lakes maritime historian in the whole country. And he founded our Maritime Museum in Detroit that became the Dawson Great Lakes Museum later. But he was a talented painter, so the university let me use his paintings throughout the book. Even the painting of the waves was called Lake Superior, and at the very beginning there, and that was one of his works that I put in the book. But you can see that my map shows this kind of spider web of lines all the way through to Chicago and Lake Michigan. Well, what happened was that their biggest ship was a money loser, and it was Phil Swartz that came up with the idea of operating it as a cruise ship and giving bargain 7-day cruises to Chicago and back. So later on, the line expanded its reach. It also, toward the end, had a line between Cleveland and Port Colborne in Ontario, and that's sort of a kind of a lake resort area as well, so you could take a day trip across the lake on the C&B line as well. As far as here goes, they used those older ships to take passengers to Put-in-Bay, Cedar Point, and Toledo. And in later years, in 1924, when those older ships were no longer in their possession, they bought the rather famous precursor to these fabulous luxury liners of the D&C line called the City of Detroit II. And it looked very much like those other steamers. It had two transverse stacks side by side on the ship rather than lengthwise. And very successful. It really took up the excess traffic for the D&C until it was rendered useless really by the bigger ships. So the C&B line bought it, and in 1924 they renovated the ship. It's still a paddle wheeler. They put a new steam engine in it, so it didn't have a walking beam above the deck. And they remodeled it. They remodeled the ship, and they took out the cabins so that it had a very nicely furnished salon. So where all these chairs and sofas are along this side and that side is where the cabins would be, and on the gallery floor as well. They just opened that up for day excursion use. And of course there's still a dining room, place to dance, music playing, and all that. It was called the Good Time. Now, maritime historians always are very disparaging, saying, what a rotten name for a very stately steamship, Good Time, right? But I think the Lion's Point was that this being an excursion, you could have a good time on their ship, right? And once this ship was put into service in 1924, it was scrapped before World War II started. But then later there were several steel-hulled diesel ships that did traverse this area that were also called the Good Time. So people from Cleveland would remember Good Time 1 and Good Time 2, I think, were steel-hulled diesel ships that probably carry a lot of fond memories for people as well. So that's parts of their fleet that we'd be familiar with. But really their first big ship, and this really lovely, lovely painting, it was the City of Buffalo. And their livery of their ships, they used a dark green hull and a black stack and sort of an ivory-colored superstructure where the cabins and interior spaces mostly were. So City of Buffalo was launched in Detroit. It was built by the Detroit Dry Dock Company. And so excursions of people came from Cleveland to watch the launch in Detroit. So Detroit took some ownership of it because it was another wonderful product of their ingenuity and industry. But the Cleveland people also named it as their ship. So when it first arrived in Cleveland, there was great fanfare. But this ship had to try and negotiate its way into the Cuyahoga River to their docks, which wasn't easy, I can tell you. But Frank Kirby, the designer of these ships, did innovate a great deal, and he incorporated on all his major steamships a bow rudder. So you have a rudder in the back that steers the ship, but these also had a bow rudder that could help the captain get into tight areas, just like the Cuyahoga River. Bridges across the Cuyahoga River had to be widened, raised, and all that, just to get the City of Buffalo into Cleveland. So it was a side-wheeler. It had the old-style overhead steam engine with a walking beam on the top, which meant that the steam power had to go from the piston, which was up and down, that's why it was called a vertical steam engine, through a rod through the roof to transfer to this walking beam, which reciprocated like this, and then drove the crankshaft of the wheels, wasting a lot of energy in the process. But for the day, it was up to date, it was fast, it was very comfortable, and really made a lot of money for the C&B line. Some specific things about the ship, I mean, it could take, whereas those smaller boats could take 300 passengers in cabins, this one had over 300 cabins and could take 650 people roughly in cabins. You could also decide to sit in the lounge overnight and not pay for a cabin, so the ship had a great capacity. Eventually, and this is something that plagued the C&B Transit Company, business and operation-wise. So now they had the City of Buffalo, but then they had two much smaller ships. So what do? Do you run the City of Buffalo one night from Cleveland to Buffalo, but from Buffalo you run those other two, so you have to double the amount of the crew, you double the amount of the coal that you're putting in these ships, et cetera, just to get the same capacity of people coming in the opposite direction. They generally didn't do that. They would fill one up as much and say, that's it. And so now you had one kind of sitting idle, you had one big one, and it was a very inefficient operation. Furthermore, when passengers heard about how great the City of Buffalo was, the nights that the state of New York or the state of Ohio did the run, people would say, I'll wait till tomorrow and go on the City of Buffalo. So they were running one ship kind of empty while the City of Buffalo was taking all the traffic every other day. And that didn't mean result in a really good business operation. So of course, the City of Buffalo was entered into service in 1896. 2 years later, the City of Erie came along. And when they built the City of Erie, they made it bigger than the City of Buffalo. So now you had this new speed queen of the Great Lakes kind of working the same way with the City of Buffalo. The City of Buffalo was old news, so people wanted to take the City of Erie. They could fit more on it. So the solution to that was that they took the City of Buffalo and put it in dry dock, sawed it in half, and added 42 feet to it and another capacity. Now you could bring the capacity from 640 people up to 726, except that the City of Erie took like 680. So now you had the bigger ship in the City of Buffalo, and that became the de facto flagship. with the city of Erie taking second place in spite of. And now, before all, the ship was enlarged, I believe in 1908, so that race where the city of Erie became the wonder ship of the Great Lakes because it was so fast, that was in 1901. So you had this imbalance in ships that I don't know if the C&B line just didn't understand what they were doing, but they seemed to propagate this. And it meant the eventual demise of the line, to be honest. So when it was enlarged, it now looked like this. So you can see between these two images that this whole section behind the stack, all the way to where the drive wheels and the steam engine were, and you see the walking beam there, this was a whole new 42-foot section that allowed more cabins on the two cabin decks, a main deck and a gallery deck. And that's not really a main deck, it was an upper deck. And then the main deck here where you can see the openings for people to get in or to bring freight in, or automobiles even. On the old ship in front of the paddle wheels, there's two big doors there. And now we've got three because we've added this whole section in. But that made the ship bigger. It was really the flagship at that time and the most profitable then. But you can see that they had to go through quite an operation to get that to happen. Really a technological marvel to be able to take a ship like that and extend it by a 42-foot section right in the middle. The city of Erie itself came online in 1898, and it was really, it did eclipse the city of Buffalo a little bit of the two ships that they had. And you can see it's rather sleek looking sitting there on the Cuyahoga River actually that's the Buffalo Harbor it's sitting in, but kind of sleek looking. The ship generally didn't call at Erie, but the city of Erie asked the C&B line with a city council proclamation, said we'd be very pleased if the C&B line named their next ship City of Erie. Now the C&B line could not name a ship City of Cleveland because the D&C line already had that name. So they settled on Erie, and they often did, because these ships were so fast, they could do a day run. They could do a night run, turn around, go back to Buffalo during the day and take day passengers. And those did stop in the Erie Harbor, either one way or the other way or occasionally. So it did sometimes call at Erie Harbor, and I know that the dock had to be rebuilt in Erie to accommodate such a big ship as the City of Erie. So again, a profitable ship. Here's a caricature from the Cleveland Plain Dealer on the day of the Great Race in 1901, memorializing the cannon shot that was let off that told the ships, on your mark, get ready, full steam ahead, to take that race, which the city of Erie eventually won. But you can see city dignitaries, maybe a gambler or two, and a captain serving as the referee, depicted one way or another in that caricature, which I think is quite fine. We talked about the ship being the speed queen of the Great Lakes, but again, 650 passengers. Pretty much, for 1898, it was up to date. I have a question here. I'll have time for questions afterwards, but do you have a question?
Just sorry to interrupt. Real quick, why are so many people going between Cleveland and Buffalo? Was it entertainment? What was up in Buffalo that's drawing all the crowd?
Well, 1901 was the Pan American Exposition, where President McKinley was shot and killed. But that was a very, very highly publicized event. So if you live in Cleveland, you're not that far from Buffalo, really. But the roads were terrible. So it was mainly that nobody had a car, nobody had a road or anything, that there was really no bus service in 1901. So taking the ship would be a natural. You could take the New York Central train, and you could either probably go overnight to Buffalo, or maybe there's a day run available as well. But why not go on the ship where now you can dine in comfort, you can sleep in a bed, experience what they called it the fresh lake water, which it's fresh lake water, but the ship was a coal-burning ship, and there was sort of soot everywhere. If you see pictures, I think that the picture of the race showed you that there was great amounts of black steam coming out. And I've got pictures of some of the earlier ships like barreling down the lake, and because they were late. And look, the amount of black smoke coming out of all those stacks on some of them was amazing. But there were advantages to taking the ship then as well. It was an established thing. It was safe. It was comfortable and all that. Plus, if you were headed further east And I believe that New York had some sort of highway system already started, just 2-lane highways really at the time. But it was okay once you got past Buffalo to drive eastward. The famous story about there was an employee of the Oldsmobile company, and Oldsmobile at the time in the early 1910s or something, early 1900s, very early 1900s, did a demo that he could drive an Oldsmobile car from Detroit all the way to New York City because there was an auto show going on in New York City. So Oldsmobile wanted to publicize it. Look, this guy drove this car. Well, it took him a month. The whole deal was that he worked with a bunch of talented auto designers that had all these innovative ideas. Ransom E. Olds, who formed Oldsmobile, left because his own board would not, like Thomas Newton, wouldn't listen to his ideas. He wanted to build bigger, more substantial, faster cars. They wanted cheap. And he couldn't live with it, so he went off and founded the REO company, Ransom E. Olds, that built trucks, right, for many years. But some of these other employees, the one guy that drove, Roy D. Chapin, I think, drove from Detroit all the way to New York, accomplished this feat, and they promised him, then we're going to develop your car that you've designed that's more efficient, that's better, and all that when you're done. When he got the race done, Oldsmobile said, yeah, we're going back to what we were doing before. So he and the others left, got the money from J.L. Hudson, the richest man in Michigan, who was the department store magnate, to form the Hudson Motor Car Company. And while the Hudson's department store never sold motor cars in it, they displayed Hudson cars in it. The money came from the fact that Roy D. Chapin was married to J.L. Hudson's niece, who he loved. He was a single man, a bachelor. He was the patriarch of his family. So out of love for his niece, he gave $50,000 at the time in 1909 to Roy D. Chapin to found the Hudson Motor Car Company, which lasted. It became American Motors at one point, and then, as is so often the case. But Hudsons were the first NASCAR cars. They were sleek. They had what they call in the late 40s, early 50s, the step-down design that made the car more aerodynamic, and you actually sat down into the frame, so they were low. I had a chance to sit in one recently. Wow, if we made cars like that now, I'd have 5 of them in my yard, but all running, not rusting. So anyway, there's all those reasons why, and I didn't repeat the question, was just why would somebody want to take a boat from Cleveland to Buffalo? And those are some of them there. So what I was saying was you could put your car in the freight hold for $5 and then take that car to Buffalo and get off there and go head east, where if you're going to Connecticut, if you were, most of the early settlers in Cleveland and in Detroit came from east. They were sort of the English that came west and settled Detroit after the fire. Before that, Cleveland was actually founded as a part of the Western Reserve, which was a Connecticut property. The land was owned by Connecticut. So when the Western Reserve broke off, the people from Connecticut essentially came here to settle Cleveland and found Cleveland and build it. So if they want to go back home where their vacations were or visit family, that would be a good way to cut some time off. And that was why the slogan, save a day the C&B way, that it allowed you to save a day on your travels if they were longer. And that did really happen. So after years of profitability and having 2 well-regarded ships on the Cleveland to Buffalo line, in 1912, the D&C line launched what was then the largest ship that became their flagship, and it was called the City of Detroit III. They had a tendency to name their ships after their ports, so when you had an older City of Detroit, the first one was just called City of Detroit, but when you built City of Detroit II, that one became City of Detroit I. And then when you built a new, bigger one, it became the City of Detroit III. So there was a City of Cleveland, a City of Cleveland II, and a City of Cleveland III for the D&C line. So it's not written purposely anywhere, because I read all the reports, the newspaper reports or journal reports about the building of what was called the SS C&B. And the name came from when they were going to build the line, I believe, got very jealous of the sort of friendly rival D&C company with that big City of Detroit III. They one-upped them. They built a ship that was 22 feet longer than the City of Detroit III, and it was going to be the first of 2 very, very large ships that would take on that Cleveland to Buffalo line. They had made a lot of money. They were able to just buy the ship partially out of their profits, partially out of stock issue and loans and things. And it was truly magnificent. It was bigger than the city of Detroit, 3, as I said, heavier tonnage, higher horsepower. And as you know, if you remember the stories of the Titanic, ocean liners went from having 1 stack to 2 stacks to 3 stacks. And finally, the Titanic and the Lusitania and the Mauretania and all that had 4 stacks. City of Detroit 3 had 3 stacks. So of course, the DNC line was going to one-up them and build a 4-stack ship. And it was so remarkable, so large, that when it would dock at the 15th Street Pier actually had to be built for this boat because there was no way it could get in the Cuyahoga River. So the line worked with that. The pier opened in 1915. This ship entered service in 1913. And when it would always back into, I'll show you an image that's completely wrong further down the line, but the ship would always back into the 9th Street Pier. That was just traditional. So the boat would sit there with all of its decks kind of towering up. It looked like a building in and of itself with 4 stacks. So people would say, yeah, I was driving on Lakeshore Drive and went by the factory the other day because it had belching smoke coming out of the stacks, and it looked for all the world like a factory right on the waterfront there. But actually, one of those, I believe, was really a dummy. Of course, illustrations like this would never show that. It would just show smoke coming out and the ship just steaming right across Lake Erie and more or less leaving an old steamer on the horizon there in its dust because it was fast. It was just a magnificent ship. The only problem was you were back to the same situation. Now you had what you advertised as, and called all the time. It was not just known as the C&B, it was known as the Great Ship C&B because it was the biggest of all. So you had this giant ship that could take several thousand, I think 2,000 passengers on board. And then the next night, the same night from Buffalo, you're running a ship that can only carry 650. So anybody that has heard about the Great Ship C&B is going to wait a day and ride on the Great Ship C&B rather than the old city of Buffalo. So because of this, the line started really losing money in the operation. They did a thing where on the weekends, they ran it twice between Buffalo and Cleveland to maximize the capacity of the C&B and use that capacity, whereas the other boats were just running unprofitably and empty. So it really became eventually a white elephant for the C&B line. It was meant to be their great flagship, their great advertising vehicle. The interiors were beautiful. They were designed by Louis O. Kyle of Detroit, who was the architect that worked with Frank Kirby on his steamship designs. And they chose sort of a Greek classical theme for the interior with Doric-type columns, Greek cross design screens, beautiful furnishings. This is the entry hall. When you'd walk in, you'd go to the purser's desk, which would be on the other side, where you see a chair up there. There's a little booth. That's the telegraph office if you wanted to send a note, or while it was in port, you could make calls to shore, but not when it was on the water, because it was a little early for wireless communications. And but opposite, on the side that you don't see, was where the purser's office would be, where you'd come in the ship on this level. Notice it's not carpeted, but it's it's a linoleum floor that people's wet shoes and whatnot from outside wouldn't stain carpet. But the purser would direct you to your room. There would be probably a bellboy that could take your luggage up, and you'd go up that grand staircase into the grand salon of the ship where your cabin would be located. And that grand salon looked like this. There was a mural done by the famous muralist William de Leftwich Dodge, which I mentioned yesterday, did murals in the Library of Congress in Washington and in he had a very long life, so in the late 20s, the Art Deco Buffalo City Hall also has a series of murals by William de Leftwich Dodge in it. And so the interior had beautiful mahogany wood carving, trim, railings of brass that, dark brass that went along with it, heavy Wilton carpets. Much of the carpeting was furnished by the Sterling and Welch Company in Cleveland. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. After World War II, Allied department stores chain merged Sterling and Welch, which is the home furnishings, the Lindner Company, which is the ladies' wear shop, and the Davis menswear store into one and created a department store called Sterling Lindner Davis. And the Sterling and Welch Company's building had a great big atrium in it. And so the biggest Christmas tree in Cleveland was always at the Sterling and Welch Company. But it wasn't profitable, it lost money, and they closed it in the 60s. Right before 1970, that store closed. But they provided the carpeting for the C&B, and the new word in the paper was that the amount of carpeting provided was bigger than the floor space of the Sterling and Welch Company itself in their headquarters on Euclid Avenue. So you can imagine that's an indicator of the size of this thing, and the luxurious finishings and furnishings that were put in there, leather chairs and whatnot. So there's even on the back there's a grand staircase, but there's also a bandstand. So an orchestra could be on the balcony there in the evening playing soft music to entertain the passengers who are sitting in these chairs. I don't see them here. One of them, I want to show you something that is anachronistic. This is the dining room. It was ivory painted enamel with fine furniture, kind of in that same sort of austere kind of Greek style at the time. Custom light fixtures around all the columns and chandeliers hung. See ceiling fans there worked into the chandeliers and all that. Buffets to serve the food. This was a parlor cabin on the ship. The vast majority of people were in what they called staterooms, were something like a railroad compartment, but you could have a parlor room with its own bathroom and shower if you could fork over the money for it. So this one you can see there's twin beds that are formed into a double, a seating area, and kind of a dressing counter there. And the door goes right out because some of them even had their own private balconies at that time out onto the outside. On the top floor of the C&B was what they called the lounge. It was the equivalent to the Gothic room of the City of Detroit 3. I don't think it's quite as overwhelming in design, but it was one of the first instances where Art Nouveau, which was a popular arts design style in Europe that was breaking away from the classicism with more flowing modern forms, which you can see in some of the paintings on the ceiling there. And the bar was both backed and fronted by Pewabic tile from Detroit. So again, a very luxurious room. One thing that I said was anachronistic that you won't see anymore, a cuspidor on the floor. So when you need to spit your tobacco, you got it right there. So that's one of the disgusting, I think, and my father chewed tobacco, so I guess I have, it didn't go over well when I accidentally threw out a term paper that I just got done typing, and he spit on it in the basket. And when I said, what the heck, can't you do that in the sink? And he said, what the hell are you throwing your term paper out for? So it was unfortunate, but I'm kind of glad that we don't trip over those anymore or anything like that. But they were common sight on a ship like this. Later on, here's the problem. They're losing money with this colossal ship that now they can't even fill it up, but they can't fill the other ones at all because anybody who's anybody wants to go on this one, right? Because it was bigger, more comfortable, had more options, and all that. So what to do? And then Thomas Newton retired, and they figured out something to do with the C&B. But I want to talk a little bit about what these ships faced. And I'm going to talk about some incidents that I found that happened to both the city of Erie and city of Buffalo to the east of Cleveland on Lake Erie. And I wanted to see if, I'm going to try not to hint at it if I can, but there's a thread that runs through all of this that is very important. So September 1900, a horrible gale occurred on Lake Erie. On freighters, barges, whatsoever, 12 people died during that gale. And the city of Erie had a tremendous battle with the gale. The engine lost steam, so it was really out of control. The crew lost control of the ship. It was being buffeted back and forth. They did heroically trying to get the steam back up. I think a valve broke or something like that. And the captain obviously was steering it to try to get it back on course to Cleveland. An interesting thing, after this terrible storm, it only arrived in Cleveland an hour and a half late. But in Cleveland, at the dock, because there were no wireless communications in 1900, the ship just didn't show up. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody knew the fate. So, of course, the newspapers, all dead on City of Erie, lost on lake and all this kind of thing. Fake news, as we'd call it nowadays. And the newspaper report said, and I'm just going to read this verbatim because it was from the newspaper. At about 5 o'clock in the morning, a sea, a mountain high, dashed upon and broke in the forward cabins, driving people at that end of the cabin out of their staterooms. So in this storm, the front mast of the ship smashed down on cabins on the top deck. They were empty, but one of the crewmen was in there, and he was injured. That was the only injury really on the thing, was that this crewman was kind of knocked out, but he was not injured badly enough that he didn't go back to work trying to keep the passengers calm and get the engines started again. The sea also disabled the steering gear, and for 20 minutes it is said the ship was beyond control of its officers. A panic ensued, and many exciting incidents occurred. Men and women ran about wild with terror. Many of them were only scantily clothed and suffered considerably from exposure in addition to their agonizing fright. Now, they might scantily clothed, they were probably sleeping in nightgowns and men's underwear and things like that, but you're frightened as hell. Get out of got to get out of this room because I'm going to die. And so it was pandemonium. I have a story. If you really want to see what one of these ships was like, the only real preserved example that's preserved intact is a Canadian ship that is now housed at the Canadian Museum of the Great Lakes in Kingston, Ontario, and they give a tour of the ship. It was an Edwardian-era ship that was built in 1907. It was built in Glasgow, Canada. Its name is Keewatin, and its sister ship was called Assiniboia. Those were Indian names because the ship went from Georgian Bay to Thunder Bay in Lake Superior. So the idea was that if you were taking the transcontinental train, now the Canadian Pacific Railway that owned the ships had what they called the lake service, because if you're going to take that arduous 7-day journey on a train from Montreal or Toronto to Vancouver, or any point west, which was a condition for the whole country of Canada to confederate, the British Columbia said, but you've got to build us a railway. We need to be connected or else we won't join. So they did. The Canadian Pacific Company won the bid to build the railway, but they also realized that that journey was really long, so they also incorporated, a little bit later on in 1907, a steamship service from, you could take a fast train from Toronto, like an hour, to a port on Georgian Bay, get on the Assiniboia in Cleveland, and do a 2-day cruise up to Thunder Bay, which was known as Port Arthur at the time, and connect with the train there. Or vice versa, on the way back, you could have this nice interlude of a lake cruise. The ships were built in Glasgow. They came under their own power to Montreal, where they were also cut in half because the Welland Canal was too small to handle them. And they were then towed through, actually the rapids, they couldn't even get through the rapids of the St. Lawrence River at the time, so they had some canals that they were towed through these canals piece by piece, put back together in Buffalo, and then served for 60 years until 1966 on that route. Very funny story was that the Assiniboia one time was coming, and I can imagine that the pandemonium on this ship was something similar, was coming through the Soo Locks, and there was a freighter, was coming from Lake Superior down into Lake Huron, and a freighter had entered the lock, lost control, wasn't able to stop, bashed into the wooden gates of the lock, opened them up, and the Assiniboia shot out like in a log flume. Okay? And it happened like this, but people were screaming, dying, and of course the newspaper reports were always talking about hysterical women that were screaming and crying, and it was all over in a split second. Well, luckily, there was a group of what they referred to as strapping young men who were on a rugby team from Winnipeg, Manitoba, that were heading to a rugby tournament in Montreal. And they said this one young woman was so hysterical that the strapping young man just grabbed her and calmed her down for the split second that this occurred. And she went, "Oh my God, you're my hero. You're my hero, and I don't know how to thank you." And he goes, "Let's go down to the bar and have a drink." He was going to extract his payment for supposedly saving this woman's life. So you'd never imagine what all the funny things that would happen on these ships, even in a state of kind of pandemonium of a tragedy. So, like I said, that there's some damage to the city of Erie at that time. Now, June of 1923, the headline said, "Tornado sweeps lake passenger ship." And it was the city of Buffalo this time. And it more or less didn't show up in Cleveland. And the newspaper reports said the steamer City of Buffalo demonstrated her seaworthiness early today when she was struck by a 100-mile gale probably 100 mile per hour would have been more accurate, of wind when 40 miles out of Buffalo. So at 12:30 at night, they left Buffalo maybe at 11, something like that, and got stuck by this gale. And you can see the damage to the boat. The whole upper deck is kind of smashed up there in the front. Again, the mast came down. And it says, though, that even though the steamer was damaged, the gale was terrible, the 500 passengers on board all survived. But that, too, there was a lot of panic and that kind of thing, even though 500 passengers paraded the cabin in pajamas and kimonos while the big passenger ship plowed through high seas, whipped by wind of almost tornado velocity. So these kind of things were not unusual on the Cleveland and Buffalo line. When I told people I was writing this book, they said, "Oh, you're going to write about all the shipwrecks, aren't you?" I said, "It's not really a book about shipwrecks. It's about the wonderful technology and artistry of these ships and how they affected the culture." But very quickly into my research, you can't tell the history of these ships without talking about shipwrecks. So there it is. But May of 1929, the city of Buffalo was 15 hours late getting into Cleveland. And it was buffeted by another storm off the coast of Ashtabula, Ohio. All night long, the ship lost control. It was just spinning, turning around, up and down, had no power. So 3 different lake steamers tried to come and help it by throwing lines across and stabilizing it. None of that worked. The lines snapped one after another. Actually, one of those ships, I believe, left the scene, sank further on in the storm. So it was a pretty big event, and the ship wound up eventually being blown to the seawall at Ashtabula. And the passengers were saying things like, that were on, and this too, I can't quote them verbatim, so I'll read it. On the deck, Captain Alan Strachan, who was quite a hero, as well known, he became the captain of the C&B, and then when the C&B was converted for naval use during World War II, they kept Captain Strachan. They hired him for the Navy because he knew the ship really well. He was the captain of the C&B eventually. So watched his vessel with its 100 lives drift steadily towards Sturgeon Point. And so somebody said, "We got into where we could see the windows of the houses clearly," and I would say it was about 2 miles. And then another said, we were just figuring out what we were going to do when it hit the shore. Another one said, "I figured she'd be driven high on the beach. She was going to roll for all of me," channeled in Mr. E. Tilton of Columbus. But then H.E. Clapp of Chicago said, "I was worried what was going to happen to my new traveling case." So there's always humor in anything. So what was the thread that carried through all this? It was that through each of those terrible storms, those ships made it. They were the product of a genius, the dean of naval architects, not just in the United States, but in the world, Frank Kirby, who planned for safety, you can't avoid being hit by a tornado on that water. But you can build a ship well enough that it's not going to sink. So that really testifies to the quality of what the C&B line brought to their operation. Now, the C&B was losing money. In 1930, it was laid up at the dock, so people could go by the factory whenever they wanted at that time. And it was Phil Swartz, the general manager, that caught on the idea. He was trying to keep the boat in some kind of use, so it wasn't just abandoned. There was a time in Cleveland where you could go to dinner and see a show on the C&B. It didn't go anywhere, it was right at the dock, but they used it as a floating nightclub restaurant. But then he got the idea to turn it into a cruise ship. And he felt that something had to be done, so they were going to try that. And these $59.95 7-day cruises all the way to Chicago and back were very popular because during the Depression era, people didn't have a lot of money to spend. $59.95 for an all-expense-paid cruise where you got entertainment, food, and whatnot on the ship was quite a good value as well. Especially in, I should have changed that. I went through it last night and I knew I had a mistake. 1933 and 1934, Chicago held the Century of Progress exposition. And so it was very, very popular for people to take the cruise. And they extended the cruise now so it didn't stop as many times, so it spent 3 days in Chicago. So you could see the fair, shop at Marshall Field and Company and things like that on your cruise. And people loved it. So they advertised it was also the largest cruise ship on the Great Lakes. Here was an advertisement for a cruise during that World's Fair for $59.50. And this ad doesn't show it. This is vaudeville entertainment. That would include Eileen Kneen, who you saw the picture of there. That it really became a moneymaker for the line, while the Buffalo route was dwindling. The roads were better. There were other options. The ships were kind of older. So that was about the only thing that made it work. And interesting thing, one of the ads that I have for that, who's here is from Cleveland? Pretty much. So are you familiar with the Maurice salad in Cleveland? A Maurice salad. It's a type of salad with ham, cheese. So in Detroit, the Maurice salad was the signature dish of the J.L. Hudson Company's restaurants. Like you had the Silver Grill at Higbee's or whatever. But that Maurice salad is known mostly. People said, yeah, there was a chef at Hudson's named Maurice, and they named a salad after him. Well, it's not true at all. I found the true story. There was a band leader in Cleveland by the name of Maurice Spitalny in the 1920s and 30s. And he eventually was so popular in Cleveland that he was burned out, so he moved to Pittsburgh and got the job as the band leader at the William Penn Hotel, which is the best hotel in Cleveland. To this day, the Maurice salad is on their menu because his name was Maurice, but he would have a meal before he rehearsed the orchestra for the night show. And he would say, he was Jewish, so he had a salad, and he wanted chicken and red pepper relish on it. It became so popular that he would serve it, other people would see it, they'd ask for it, so they just put it on the menu. And to this day, you can go to the restaurant in the William Penn Hotel and have a Maurice salad. But from there, it came to the Holland Inn Hotel in Cleveland, where they added ham, because now it wasn't really driven by Maurice himself, and cheese to it. But then at some point, it came to Detroit and became a knockout favorite, and everybody from Detroit thinks it's their salad, that's our salad, that's our dish, but it's really a Pittsburgh dish and somewhat a Cleveland dish before it ever got to Detroit. So I found the true story, but one of these ads said that you can dance to the strains of the Maurice Spitalny Orchestra on one of these C&B cruises. So even this is connected between the department stores of these big cities and things like that. There's always some sinew of connectivity between them. So here's people getting ready to leave on one of those cruises. The ship is full. And like I said, it backed into you can see a little bit of the 9th Street terminal buildings there. And everybody's looking to have fun on the C&B there. Here is a photograph of the deck during a cruise where the passengers are crowded around and playing a game called horse racing. So the three ladies that are stooped down there have a wooden silhouette of a horse that's painted to look like a horse on a stand, and somebody would be rolling dice for each horse. And then the one that won the race, as it went down, every number on the dice was a foot's travel, and the deck was marked off. So at the end, somebody would be a winner and win a door prize or something like that. But obviously quite popular because there are a lot of people on the cruise, and they're all enjoying these deck games. There's several deck games they played every day. They would, for exercise, the trumpeter or an accordion player would come out and play Shufflin' Off to Buffalo. And if you walked around the C&B 6 times, it was a mile. So they had like a mile parade around the outside decks. Here we are in the English pub in the hull of the C&B at the stern, and you can see a violin player and a guitar player, and people with, I see somebody with a Nick and Nora glass here having a cocktail, and some cigarettes. Unfortunately, at the time was very popular. I'm not sure what she's doing. She doesn't look real happy, but people are in that pub enjoying their cruise with music and all that stuff. In the dining room, there was an orchestra to play while dining. There was a ballroom for music and dancing afterwards on the top deck, because it was a big ship with tons of lounges and rooms and things like that. So this gives an idea of and they were able to advertise the C&B as the luxury and comfort of a great floating hotel, which it truly was. You had a luxury accommodation for that cruise. In 1938, the C&B line cover that went out of business, and the C&B was bought by a Chicago travel professional, and he founded another line called the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company of Illinois. And that continued these cruises after the C&B line went out of business in 1938. So that lasted until about 1943. The war came, and even though being on the Great Lakes was popular during the war because you were not hunted by a German submarine, but 1943 something happened that caused that to come to an end. Well, but I mean, you can see a very beautiful. That's a really good depiction of the ship in its beautiful green hull colors. The end came really, the company was losing a lot of money. Even though the C&B was very popular, it was being dragged down by the regular operation between Cleveland and Buffalo. And in 1938, right at the 9th Street Pier, the city of Buffalo caught fire, and it was a total loss. You can see this photograph. People are standing on the roof of the 9th Street terminal, and the firemen are trying to put out the fire there. Now, I also heard from Phil Swartz's son that there was only one person on board. The ship was getting readied for the season. It was springtime, and the guy felt a need to go down 9th Street to what he called the liquor store, because that's what his mother told him. It's not if he said, don't really repeat that as fact, because it's only what I heard from my mother. And she claimed that the guy left his coffee hot plate boiling, and that's what started the fire. And that the whole city of Buffalo was ruined. They were stuck with the city of Erie, which by that time was a secondary ship and only did that Cleveland to Port Colborne run. So the board of directors decided to just can it right there. There would be no 1938 season. It was over. Luckily, the C&B was bought and cruised for many years under the aegis of that Illinois line. And in 1943, the C&B was seized by the government, and it was converted into an aircraft carrier. So it was the only four-stacked paddle wheel aircraft carrier in the world. Likewise, the Greater Buffalo of the DNC line got the similar treatment. And so those served as training ships. And I talked yesterday about George W. Bush being one of the most famous trainees on the USS Wolverine, which was the old C&B converted to an aircraft carrier. And being that he was from Texas and grew up in a hot climate, he said that flying over Lake Michigan, trying to learn how to land his plane and take off his plane from the USS Wolverine was the coldest he had ever been in his whole life, because the plane obviously didn't have heating, and the ship was somewhat lacking in that as well. And the weather was bad because they trained in the wintertime on Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is sort of a graveyard, not only for shipwrecks, but for aircraft carriers that didn't stop at the end of the deck. I mean, war aircraft that didn't stop at the end of the deck. If the water was shallow enough, they had a crane on board that could pick the boat right up out of the water, pick the plane out of the depths of the water, dry it off, and put it back into use. And obviously, diving, as somebody, I don't know if they here today mentioned the popularity of scuba diving, that many people are rediscovering these days, the actual shipwrecks, some of these airplanes and things like that on our lakes, where there's a propensity for shipwrecks there. And it's of great interest now because they can diagram, or they can scan it with a computer and diagram just how those wrecks are situated. And then the problem becomes, so what do you do with them? Do you leave it there as sort of a monument to what happened, or do you bring it up for souvenirs, or what? So there's lots of legal questions. It found that many of them that are wood, as Greg, the gentleman there, said, the wood actually didn't rot, as you would think it might have, but it might have been the temperature, cold temperature at the bottom, or something like that helped it as well. So that really brought to an end the C&B line. Here's an advertising brochure from the early 1920s, when the C&B was still new. I didn't tell you how the C&B got its name. When the line was commissioned the ship, and they had a contest for people to name their ship. So people came up with, they wanted to call it the Forest City, after Cleveland. And two young ladies submitted the idea that since it was the C and B, Cleveland and Buffalo line, that their big ship should be just called C and B, spelled out. And the management considered that was the winner, and the two girls had to split the first prize, but the majority, like it was $50 is what they got at the time. $30 went to the one who submitted her answer first, and $20 went to the other one. So, and they were both from Ohio, from near Columbus, I think, that decided that they wanted to enter that name. So in this photograph, it's an advertising photo showing people showing up, crowds getting on the ship at the 9th Street Terminal, except the ship always backed in. So this, because it was a better image to show that beautiful, it sells for $80, but I will be selling them for $75 today. And the good thing is if you choose that you'd like to purchase it, you don't have to pay the shipping on an 8-pound book, which could be pretty substantial, about 15 bucks. So I just wanted to make a plug for my own work before I sit down and shut up. It has 672 pages, illustrations that have never been seen publicly before, that I contracted and paid to use in the book. So I want to end with that, and also end with a sincere thanks from my heart for you spending your time with me this afternoon. And I hope that this has been informative and entertaining for you as well.
Questions? No. Always has one.
Yeah. Which was faster? Which was the faster ship, the City of Erie or the C&B, and how fast were they?
The C&B was, the question is that which was fastest. The C&B would be by far the fastest because of the huge horsepower of its gigantic steam engine and boilers, which allowed it to travel at 23 miles per hour across the lake. The other ones did 19, 20 and the max. Sounds like a small difference, right? But in terms of a long run like that, and the advertising value, if we got the fastest ship, was really big. Yes, sir.
You referenced the state of Ohio, a Frank Kirby design ship. My understanding is she ran aground right out here off Rattlesnake Island.
Yes.
And then was towed into, I think, the Craig Shipbuilding Company in Toledo.
Okay.
What can you tell us about what happened to the state of Ohio?
Whether it was actually stayed at the Craig shipyard or not, but at one point it burned in the early 1921, I believe, and so the hull was taken to Hamilton, Ontario, and scrapped. So the steel of the hull was saved, or iron in that case, was saved and recycled at the time. But the ship was a total loss, and that was around the time. Now you had that much extended city of Buffalo and the city of Erie, so the service to Toledo was reduced strictly from Cleveland to Put-in-Bay and back, stopping at Cedar Point as well. If anybody's ever heard of the great Eastland disaster in Chicago, where an excursion ship known as the Eastland keeled over and threw people. If they weren't killed when the ship capsized, the Chicago River at the time flowed outward into Lake Erie and basically was the toilet pipe of Chicago. And so people died of dysentery from being in the water and all that kind of thing. 890 people, I believe, mostly of Eastern European descent, that worked for the Western Electric Company that hired the ship for an excursion to go to Michigan City, which was a resort at the time. That ship also sailed out of Cleveland to Cedar Point, but when it made a stop, let's say at Lorain at that Black River Park, people got off because they said, it was all over the place. And so some of that traffic between Cleveland and Put-in-Bay and that was diminishing. And so they just used the state of New York then for that route on once a day basis. But the state of Ohio, which was the previous city of Cleveland, was a total loss at that point. Except for that one in Canada, none of these ships came out in a good state. When they were done, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you.
One question.
What is the meaning of the blue flag with all the stars on it? Any of the images?
I'm really not sure. I focused a little bit more on like the one that has the DNC logo on it, but the blue stars, I don't know if that was just a patriotic thing at the time, or in this case, that is an image taken from a hand-tinted postcard. It may have very much just been the artist's license at the time. I never heard anything of what that was significant of at all. Anybody else? Okay, we're good. Thank you again. Sorry I almost skipped the question section.